The book is here. It's Roots of Underdevelopment, a new economic and political history of Latin America and the Caribbean. The book, in a nutshell, tries to understand when events in the past have an impact today. So it used to be that economic history was more contained in the past, like maybe you wanted to study slavery in Brazil, so you were very interested in the 17th century, the 18th century, all the way to abolition, or the British Industrial Revolution, and then you would go very into the UK and how Manchester and Liverpool during that time period behaved. And now there is more of a dialogue with the present of, it's not only about thinking about slavery in Brazil as it lived in the past, but obviously a huge legacy, demographic legacy, economic legacy, inequality legacy.
How does the book help us understand the greatest challenges that Latin America faces nowadays?
I think that by understanding better the Latin American history, so it's a book that obviously it's about history, but at the same time it's thinking about what's going on in Latin America today. So what are the biggest challenges? Maybe inequality, corruption, crime, violence. So I think that it helps us in understanding what are like the deeper roots of those problems. Some chapters make that very evidently of, okay, why is Colombia so violent? And even though it's a very democratic country, and others, even though they don't directly say that, I think at the end of the day, they are trying to make that case. So I think it's useful for students, and I think it's useful for researchers and policymakers of how is it that like Latin America is today, and then part of that answer is like how it was in the past. And maybe the second is to be more specific, like it used to be that when we think about like Latin American policy or economics, we had a one-size-fits-all narrative or solution. Here it's to think, even though obviously there are some common threads, to think about what in particular is specific or special about the history of El Salvador or Nicaragua or Peru, etc. So I think that for that the book is good in like being a bit more specific when it comes to policy, and maybe realize that some solutions that would be great for Brazil would not be great for Argentina and things like that.
Could you speak a little bit more to the middle income curse in improving economic and political objectives for Latin American countries?
It's related to the fact that nowadays Latin America is not the poorest region in the world. It's not the richest region. It's a middle income region. It's definitely the most unequal region in the world. So that's like a whole other topic. And as countries become richer, also the demands become a bit different. So maybe Chile would be case in point of a country that is not poor anymore, that the poverty levels have decreased, thankfully, but that starts thinking about other things. So how is it that citizens that now have a bit more income not only want, let's say, nutrition, but better schooling, not only schooling, but better housing, not only housing, but healthcare, pension. So, and a potential trap, quote unquote, is staying in that equilibrium and never like really becoming truly rich. So I think that's the case for some Latin American countries now. And the book touches upon some of these topics of how is it that, I mean, maybe Latin America used to be poorer and now it's richer, but eventually we want to like be even richer.
You talk in the book about mechanisms of transmission, and that's something that also like a lot of the chapters cover. Can you mention what are these and like one of the main ones or two of the main ones that the book talks about?
Yes, so given that a lot of the chapters have this kind of persistence framework of something that happened way in the past and having an impact to today, then the natural question is like, if that's true, imagine, I don't know, the role of slavery or the role of missions. These are just two examples of the book for Suriname and Paraguay. How is it that today these things might still have an effect? So it's not only like, is it true that, I don't know, conflict has an impact, yes or no, on Latin American development today? But if so, what are the specific mechanisms of transmission? So just to give an example, in the case of missions in Paraguay, we find with a co-author, we write about Paraguay with Moises Pedroso, and we find that areas that had more missions in the past are richer today. So then the question is why? And then we delve into the mechanisms in this case of human capital transmission, but then you can still say like, well, but why? Why is it that like these areas had more human capital, even though like this shock was more than 250 years ago? So then you start thinking about there could be cultural mechanisms of transmission, like intergenerational transmission, indigenous assimilation to colonial society. So it's kind of like what happens in the interim in terms of intermediate time periods, but also what happens in a mechanism sense in terms of economics. So for instance, same country, Paraguay, conflict might have an important long-term legacy. In this case, in Paraguay, it will be the War of Triple Alliance, later on the Guerra del Chaco, War of the Chaco. How is it that long ago conflict, I don't know, 1860s or 1890s, would still have an impact to today? So maybe it's like through a demographic channel. So it's kind of to not only say, yes, there is an impact, or no, there's no impact, but through which specific channels of transmission.
I'd be very curious to hear if in the process of working on this volume, as well as editing the chapters of some of your co-authors, if there was a surprising empirical result to you, or one that really stood out.
I was very impressed and surprised with the chapter on Ecuador. It's a chapter on an institution called Concertaje. I think we already knew more about other institutions like the MITA in Peru and Bolivia, maybe missionaries in Paraguay, much less about this institution of Concertaje in Ecuador. So what Alex Rivadeneira, who's the author of that excellent chapter, finds is that areas that had more of this Concertaje institution, which, let me explain, it's kind of like a feudal arrangement where indigenous people were quote unquote tied to the land. So literally the farms could be bought or sold with the indigenous people in the land. You can imagine how terrible that was. That could still have an effect today, even though that institution obviously was thankfully abolished more than 100 years ago during independence. So I was surprised by that result, and it's a very careful study of kind of like a classic persistence study of saying it's not only that colonial institutions are bad, but here I'm going to show you one particular colonial institution, in this case Concertaje, on one particular country, Ecuador, and this is how bad it was. Having said that, it's also interesting because these type of institutions were there also in different areas of Latin America, maybe not with those names, but one could also think about the externality. So this is not only important for Ecuador, but also for other countries.
How does your book differ from previous historic of Latin America books and like other type of publications?
Yeah, so I think that some books started with one approach, like the structuralist approach or the colonialist approach, and then developed that through a series of chapters. So maybe the difference there is that here, I, rather than having like one topic and fully develop that, I allowed people just to write about different things. Having said that, I think this is a book that does care about some unifying conditions like good data, empirical studies. We already talked about mechanisms of transmission. So it's more about the way that we're interested in having, let's say, causal evidence or causal estimates, or at least empirical studies, rather than topics. So I think that's like a big difference. I think it's a difference that we're covering more countries than other books. So other books would say, and again, maybe historically, if you wrote about Latin America, you cared about Mexico, Peru, and one other country, maybe Argentina, maybe Colombia. Here we have chapters on Suriname. We have chapters on Uruguay. So we really didn't want to leave some smaller countries aside just because they're small. And I think also the fact that it's an edited volume adds to the voices and opinions. So it's not only like me saying, well, I think that the most important thing is this, but it's like a chorus of voices saying, well, I mean, we think that it could be migration, but some other people could think that it's a human capital or elite formation, and then you kind of like, again, develop that more organic process. And I think there are pros and cons of both approaches. So I'm not saying that this is superior, but it's different in that way.
How can we take the lessons from this book and enact real policy change in these countries? That conversation is one that's had between academics who have studied the empirics and who have produced the research, and the policymakers who implement changes based on them. Do you have some thoughts about how, if you're speaking to a young policymaker, what is their responsibility to understand some lessons from this book?
It's like an invitation to start a dialogue. So for instance, now there's a project of LACID, that is the Latin American and the Caribbean Inequality Report, which is a mix of policymakers and academics. So for that, I mean, it's a separate project, but I'm studying the role of inequality and the origins of inequality in Latin America. So clearly from an academic standpoint, but we are talking literally to policymakers and their policymakers involved. So I think those types of dialogues are very productive. And maybe one thing that is emerging from that group is that it's important to understand what are the root causes of some of these problems. And again, maybe not to push too much on causality, meaning like how important is to determine that a process goes from A to B and not from B to A. It's important for policymaking to understand like how causality works if you want to solve or change or mix things. So if we only know that Latin America is unequal now, but we don't know that maybe in the case of Brazil, some of the deep roots could be slavery, then maybe some of the policies could be misguided. So in that way, even though history looks like far removed, I think that a more thorough understanding of history could actually be practical for policymakers.
Suppose I was educated whenever it would have been, let's say the 90s, and I read Open Veins. What would one or two of my misconceptions be?
Open Veins essentially says everything that happened in Latin America is someone else's fault. So if Argentina is poor, Chile is poor, is because of, I don't know, the Europeans or the Americans. So it's more of an external focus, and I would almost even say blame. Whereas in this book, we tried to look, at least in most chapters, internally in Latin America. Like, what is it that happened? I mean, of course, there's going to be external forces. Colonization is an important one. Trade is an important one. So we have chapters on multinationals. We have chapters on slavery. We have chapters on missions. But it's more like it's maybe Latin American development or underdevelopment is our fault as Latin American citizens. And let's look at our own histories and internally what happened, instead of saying like, well, it's everything, it's like someone else's fault. I think that was true for Open Base of Latin America. It was definitely true for structuralism, that was also trying to find what were the problems with Latin America, given, I don't know, the unfair trade conditions with the West and things like that. So I would say that it's more of a book that is written from within the region. Actually, essentially all of the scholars, or most of the scholars, are also Latin American. So I think it's our voices, and we try to blame external factors a bit less. I mean, of course, colonialism is a big one that is still there, and it was kind of like imposed from the outside, but it's a more introspective exercise. I think more and more voices should be integrated. There's clearly a problem or a lack of diversity in economics and economic research. So more female voices, and I think that the book doesn't do a terrible job. But clearly that's one aspect where we can improve. But as the conclusion suggests, also maybe indigenous voices, maybe other racial minorities. So we tend to think about maybe Afro-Latin Americans, and that's very well covered in the book. But what about Asian Americans? And these are very important communities. I mean, if you think about Sao Paulo or Lima, some of the biggest Japanese communities in the world. So but we don't tend to think about like Asian Latin Americans as a super relevant group. Or same is true for people of Indian descent, like India, the country, in the Caribbean. So I think that yes, there is. It's better than just having a book from someone that maybe was an Oxford history professor from the UK or a Stanford American professor telling us what's right and wrong about our continent. Obviously, these are very valuable analyses, but it's still not all the way to incorporate maybe the full problematic. So this, yes, we are a bit more Latin American here, but there are other voices in Latin America that should and could be heard. So maybe that's just like where it would go, and then maybe in 10 years they would say like, oh, but there are all these topics that we didn't discuss and that finally we're discussing, fine, but maybe like this book was the first step towards that direction.
To a student thinking about the VSE or BIE specifically, why is UBC or VSE a great place to, and who else might they work with if they're interested in these kinds of questions?
We are probably one of the best places in the world right now to study these types of questions. In a big way, this book is trying to think about historical development in Latin America. Almost the whole field of historical development. I don't know if it was started, founded, or condensed, or developed, but by Nathan Nunn, who's now a professor here. So this is our Latin American reflection, but obviously there's a global reflection that Nathan has worked a lot on, maybe with a more African slant. He has pioneering work on the role of African slavery for underdevelopment. So clearly he would be one person, but there are many scholars that are looking. I mean, the case of Claudio Ferraz in Brazil, Mauricio Dreligman has looked more, even though he's Argentinian, at Spain. So there's actually a lot of economic history research at the VSE. So if you're interested in those kinds of topics, we are a hotbed. With some recent hires, Reka Huhash, thinking more about industrial policy worldwide with a focus on Europe, thinking about the Napoleonic blockades. So yeah, we have a lot of researchers interested in these topics. And I think that not only that, but also the interplay with other fields. So I think in that sense that you were saying, if the book is interdisciplinary, yes it is, but also not only with other disciplines, but also other sub-disciplines in economics. And I think here at the VSC, when we think about history, we're also thinking about political economy, we're also thinking about development, and that's like a very fertile ground for research, and I think for both directions. I think that as economic historians, we benefit from the insights of political economy, and people in political economy, development, or other fields also, I think, can learn from that historical depth. But back to like how different disciplines are important, maybe I would also start by reading the history of your own country. You know, like there's some that, I don't know, the condensed history of Brazil or Mexico or Colombia. So reading and knowing your own history, I think it's very important.